It took me almost 3 years of therapy to process what happened to me in that village and to finally be able to talk about it with others. For a long time, I believed what I experienced was tied to the trauma of losing my mother. My therapist thought it might be PTSD, grief playing tricks on my mind, making me see and feel things that weren't real. And for a while, I accepted that explanation. But deep down, I know it was more than that. It wasn't just my grief. What happened in that village was real. It all started in late 2021 when a friend recommended I watch the Chernobyl miniseries. I was hooked from the first episode like an addict to cocaine. After watching it, I became obsessed. I spent weeks reading everything I could find about Chernobyl. Not just the facts, but the personal stories, the ones that spoke of a world frozen in time and abandoned overnight. The thought of visiting those places, left to decay in eerie silence, consumed me. That's how I found the website offering tours near the Exclusion Zone. The moment I booked the trip, it felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. I told myself it was just curiosity, but the pull was stronger than that. It was as if something was drawing me in, beyond just fascination. I arrived in Ukraine a few weeks later, ready to finally see this forgotten world for myself. I ended up on a small bus with a guide and a group of people, strangers bound together by the same curiosity that had brought us all there. The bus rumbled along the uneven road, its windows fogged from the cold, damp air outside. Mist hung heavy around us, swallowing everything beyond a few feet and turning the landscape into a blur of shadowy shapes. Broken buildings and twisted trees flashed by, fading into the white fog before I could fully make them out. As the bus crept deeper into the fog, I felt the weight of the place pressing down on me. The excitement I had felt before started to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The air was cold, sharper than I expected, and the mist clung to everything around us. The guide was explaining our next stop, Yaniv, a village only a few kilometers from the reactor, abandoned like so many others. His words barely registered. My mind was focused on what was waiting outside, on the crumbling remains of a place that had been left behind. We slowed to a stop. The doors hissed open, letting in a cold, biting air that clawed at my skin. My boots hit the ground, and the cold earth seemed to absorb the sound, muffling everything. The others murmured behind me, their voices low, blending into the dense fog that swallowed the village of Yaniv whole. The guide pointed to the crumbling buildings, his words drifting through the mist. I wasn't listening. I stood apart, eyes tracing the jagged lines of rooftops and shattered windows. The village looked frozen, untouched for decades. No movement, no sound. Only the mist, curling through the streets like something alive, weaving around the broken structures. My fingers tightened around the strap of my bag. The hum of the Geiger counter clipped to my jacket was a steady reminder of where I was. I didn't need it to remind me of the unseen threat in the air, but that wasn't what held me still. There was something else. A weight hung over the village, thick and heavy, like the air itself was watching. I stepped away from the group, moving toward one of the houses. The door hung loosely, barely attached to its frame, and the windows were broken, dark openings that gave no hint of what lay inside. The fog thickened, wrapping itself around my legs as I moved closer, making it hard to see beyond a few feet. The others faded behind me, their voices disappearing into the white silence. There was nothing left of Yaniv, just bones of what had been, crumbling into the earth. But as I stood there, staring into the shadows of the abandoned house, I felt it. A shiver crawled up my spine, slow and deliberate, like a hand brushing against the back of my neck. The silence deepened as I moved closer to the house. My breath hung in the cold air, curling into thin wisps that disappeared into the fog. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, cracked by time and abandonment, and each step seemed to echo in the stillness around me. I paused at the threshold, my hand hovering just inches from the rough wooden door. The wood was warped, weathered by years of exposure, and the faint creak of the door moving slightly in the wind made my pulse quicken. Inside, there was nothing but darkness, a heavy kind that seemed to press against the broken walls, swallowing everything. The air was colder here, sharper, biting at my skin. My eyes flicked back to the others in the group, now distant figures, barely visible through the fog. Their voices were faint murmurs, like whispers carried on the wind. I was alone, standing in front of a place that had been forgotten by the world. Suddenly, a voice behind me broke through the stillness, low and hoarse. "You don't want to go in there." I spun around. A man stood a few feet away, his face pale, gaunt, his clothes worn and dirt-stained. His eyes were fixed on mine, wide and unblinking, the fog between us swirling with each shallow breath he took. His skin was too pale, stretched thin over hollow cheeks and dark, sunken eyes. He looked worn, as if whatever had once made him human had been slowly pulled away, leaving only a shadow of the person he might have been. He didn't seem to notice my stare, his own eyes flicking nervously around the fog as if expecting something to materialize out of it. His chest rose and fell rapidly, each breath creating small clouds of vapor that dissolved almost instantly in the cold air. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His gaze flicked to the house, then back to me. His body was tense, like he was ready to bolt at the slightest movement. "I'm with a tour group," I said, trying to sound confident, but my voice faltered. "We have a guide. We were exploring the village." His gaze snapped back to mine, sharp and filled with something close to desperation. "What group?" he asked, his voice suddenly tight, eyes narrowing. I swallowed, glancing around at the thick fog that had swallowed the village. The others were gone, and the silence was suffocating. The fog, it must have separated us. He didn't seem convinced. His expression darkened, his fingers twitching at his sides. "There are rules here," he muttered, almost to himself. "You need to follow them if you want to leave." "What rules?" I asked, my throat tightening with the weight of his words. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Don't stay out after dark. Don't let them see you've noticed them. Never follow the lights and never enter a house that has a red door." I frowned. A red door? Why so specific? The rule felt oddly precise, and for a moment it almost seemed ridiculous. The man's face turned serious, his voice low but sharp. "It's not just the color, it's what's behind it. You can't ever open a red door in this village." I shook my head, still not understanding. "But why? What's behind it?" He leaned in closer, his voice shushed. "I don't know exactly. Nobody does. But the ones who've opened a red door, they never come back. It's like they vanish, swallowed by whatever's in there. The house, the door, it's not part of this world. Once you cross through, there's no coming back." I felt a chill run down my spine, his words carrying an eerie weight. "But what's inside?" I asked, my voice quieter now. He shook his head, his expression grim. "No one knows for sure. Some say it's a trap, that it leads to something that isn't part of this village. Others say there's something inside, something waiting, and it feeds off people's fear. Whatever it is, the moment you touch that door, it knows you're there, and it won't let you go." My pulse quickened. What happens if I break the other rules? His eyes darted back to me and his voice dropped even lower. "They'll find you." Before I could speak again, a flicker of light appeared in the distance, cutting through the fog like a small beacon. It was faint but steady, and seemed to hover just beyond the crumbling rooftops. The man's face drained of color, his body stiffening as he stared at the glow. "Don't follow it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "No matter how close it seems." My chest tightened, and I couldn't pull my eyes away from it. The air felt heavier, pressing against my skin, cold and thick. It wasn't just the light that unsettled me. It was the way it seemed to move, slowly drifting like it was searching for something. "We need to leave before they come," he muttered. His eyes darted toward the village, scanning the buildings around us. Without another word, the man tugged at my sleeve, pulling me along. My feet felt sluggish, but I followed him, each step echoing in the stillness of the village. The ground shifted beneath me, uneven and cold, the air heavy with the weight of silence. The houses rose around us, dark shapes against the mist. Each building seemed to sag under the weight of years, some barely standing, others collapsed into rubble. But as we moved, one house stood out. It was mostly intact, its windows dark and lifeless, but the door, a sharp, vivid red, stood out like a wound in the fog. My mind raced with his words, repeating over and over, "Never enter a house with a red door." A cold knot formed in my stomach as I stared at the door, its red surface somehow more ominous now. It looked so ordinary, but the way he spoke about it made it seem like it was alive, waiting for someone to make the mistake of getting too close. The red paint was fresh, unnatural in a place that had been forgotten. It seemed to pulse in the mist, almost alive, like it was watching us. "We can't stay here," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. His eyes stayed fixed on the door, his body rigid. A faint sound cut through the fog, low and rhythmic, something dragging across the ground. My muscles tensed, my breath catching in my throat. The man's face drained of color, his fingers trembling now as he pulled me further away. We moved quickly, our footsteps muffled by the thick fog that surrounded us. The dragging sound followed, slow but persistent, scraping across the ground like something heavy being pulled. My pulse raced in my ears, but I forced my legs to keep moving, to keep following the man's hurried steps. The man suddenly stopped. I nearly stumbled into him, the sudden halt sending a wave of confusion through me. He stood still, his head slightly tilted, listening. His breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling quickly. "What is it?" I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. His eyes flicked toward a nearby building, its roof collapsed, its windows empty. The door was slightly ajar, hanging off its hinges. He moved closer, pulling me along, his steps quieter now. "We have to hide, now!" The dragging sound came again, louder, followed by the same soft whisper that seemed to cling to the edges of the fog. My heart skipped a beat. Whatever was making that sound was getting closer. We quickly went toward the broken building, pushing the door open just enough for us to slip inside. The air inside was damp and stale, carrying the scent of decay. Shadows clung to the walls, thick and oppressive, making it hard to see anything beyond a few feet. He let go of my arm and quickly moved toward one of the broken windows, crouching low and peering outside. I stood frozen, listening to the faint scraping sound outside. It circled the building, slow and deliberate, like it was searching. The whispering followed, faint but persistent, its words impossible to make out but filled with a cold malice. The man turned to me, his face pale. "Stay quiet, don't move." The room felt smaller with every second that passed. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it, the sound filling the space between the slow, rhythmic scraping outside. The man crouched lower by the window, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared into the fog. His body was stiff, frozen in place, as if any movement would draw whatever was out there right to us. The whispering grew louder, threading through the silence like a ghostly breath, too low to understand but thick with intent. My skin prickled, a cold sweat breaking out across my body. I kept my back against the wall, my fingers brushing against the damp surface, as if touching something solid could anchor me to the moment, keep me from falling into the terror that was wrapping itself around me. Outside, the dragging sound stopped. The man stiffened. His eyes met mine for a split second, panic flashing in them. Neither of us moved, barely even breathing. The fog swirled outside the broken window, and for a moment, everything went completely still. Then came a knock. It was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. A slow, deliberate tap against the front door, almost polite, like someone waiting to be invited inside. I froze, my body tensing as I stared at the door. The man's face went pale, his lips parting in a silent gasp. Another knock, louder this time. The man's eyes widened with fear. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He gestured toward me frantically, shaking his head, his fingers trembling as he motioned for me to stay where I was. A third knock echoed through the small room. The door creaked slightly under the pressure, as if whoever or whatever was outside, was losing patience. My stomach twisted into knots, and I pressed myself harder against the wall, trying to disappear into the shadows. Don't let them see you've noticed them. The rule echoed in my mind, growing louder with every knock I heard. Don't answer it, he whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes locked on the door. No matter what you hear, don't answer it. The air felt heavy, thick with dread. I didn't dare breathe as I nodded. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound itself. But then, a voice drifted through the door, soft, familiar.
Help me, please. I'm lost.
My blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. One of the women from the tour group. It was her voice, but something about the way it sounded made the hairs on my neck rise. The man's face twisted in horror. He shook his head violently, his eyes pleading with me. Don't listen, he whispered, gripping my arm so tight it hurt. It's not her. It's never them. The knocking resumed, harder now, more insistent. The door rattled in its frame, and the voice grew louder, more frantic. It called my name. The voice was so familiar, so close to the real thing, that it made my stomach churn with doubt. My heart screamed at me to open the door, to help her, but the cold dread that had settled into my bones kept me rooted in place. The voice continued, then wavered, breaking apart, the sound growing less human with every word.
Please, let me in. I can't find anyone.
And then, it stopped. The silence was sudden, suffocating. We waited, frozen, our breaths shallow and strained, listening for any sign of movement outside. My heart pounded painfully in my chest, the anticipation unbearable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man exhaled slowly, relaxing just slightly. It's gone, he whispered, though his eyes remained wide and alert. The man's face grew tense as the last traces of light faded from the sky. His gaze shifted to the darkening village outside. We can't stay here, he said, his voice low. It's getting dark. We have to find your group. Come on, the man urged, his voice sharper now. If we stay, they'll find us. You have to trust me. I nodded, pushing away the cold dread that was settling in my chest. Together, we stepped out into the thickening fog, moving quickly, my heart pounding with every step. The village around us was silent, eerily so, and every shadow felt like it was watching. The fog was growing denser by the second, and I could barely see the man beside me as we moved through the village. The darkness pressed in closer, and the air felt colder, sharper, biting at my skin. I tried to keep my breath steady, focusing on one step at a time. Then, through the fog, I saw movement. Shapes, figures. My pulse quickened. It's them, I whispered, my voice tight with relief. My group. The man didn't respond. He only gestured for me to move forward. I broke into a run, my legs feeling weak beneath me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The closer I got, the clearer the figures became. I could make out the outline of the guide, standing at the front, and others huddled together behind him. The relief washed over me, replacing the cold fear that had gripped me for so long. As I approached, the guide turned, his eyes widening in shock. Where the hell have you been? His voice rang out, cutting through the silence. Are you okay? We've been searching for you for almost 3 days. The words hit me like a punch. 3 days? That wasn't possible. It couldn't have been more than a few hours since I wandered off. My mind raced, trying to process what he was saying, but everything felt disjointed, surreal. I don't understand, I muttered, shaking my head. I got lost, and I was with him. I turned to gesture to the man who had guided me through the fog, the one who had saved me. But as I looked over my shoulder, the fog began to lift. He was gone. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. The fog thinned, rolling away like smoke, revealing the village in a soft gray light. The man, he had vanished, as if he had never existed at all, disappearing with the fog that had clung to the village for so long. The guide came closer, his face softening as he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Let's go. You can explain on the way back," he said gently. "We're heading back. We were just getting ready to leave." I glanced back one last time. The village now empty, the mist gone. There was no sign of the terror that had gripped me, no trace of the man who had guided me through the dangers of the fog. It was like everything I had experienced had been erased, as if the village itself had swallowed it whole. Without a word, I followed the group to the bus. My body ached, my mind swirling with confusion and disbelief. The fear and the rules still clung to the edges of my thoughts, refusing to fade completely. But as we left Yaniv behind, it all seemed to slip away into the emptiness, just like the man had. I settled into my seat, staring out of the window as the village grew smaller in the distance. My mind couldn't stop racing, replaying everything that had happened. Who was he? That man who had appeared and disappeared like part of the fog itself. How had he known about the rules, and why had he helped me? A deeper question gnawed at me. Why had I been drawn here in the first place? The fascination with Chernobyl had always felt like more than just curiosity. The overwhelming urge to visit this village, to explore its forgotten streets, hadn't felt accidental. It was as if something had been pulling me here, something far beyond simple passion. I couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened in Yaniv was more than just a strange encounter. There was something about the village, something buried beneath the surface that had called out to me. But what was it? And would I ever truly know? Hello, creepy community. Thank you for watching. I also want to give a big thank you to my members. I truly appreciate your support. If you're looking for a similar story, check out the one on screen. Lastly, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay creepy and see you in the next story.